Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar this morning. I'm Emily Marsh from the Greater Concord Chamber of Commerce. I'm the Events and Marketing Coordinator there. I want to thank you all for attending this morning. And thank you especially to Orr Reno for joining us today and being our presenters for this event. You may have attended some of the Chamber's Orr Reno Legal Breakfast Series, which are, a little bit on hold right now as everyone's working remotely and such, but I'm really grateful that we could partner with them again. They've been, a great Chamber member and partner with us over the years and have a lot of really great insight to share on this topic. So speaking of that, if you have additional questions after the event today, please check out the Chamber website. We have a COVID-19 page right linked on our homepage, so you can go straight to our website, click on that link, access resources. We have a larger blog post that's updated basically constantly with new resources, updates on things that are going on. So I would definitely recommend utilizing that. You can also sign up for the Chamber's emails, and we will send you updates via email as well, which is really helpful. We're also recording this webinar today and have recorded previous webinars and have a page for that under our resources tab on our website, where you can watch those recordings as well. So the Chamber website is concordnhchamber.com. If you have additional questions afterwards, I know the Orr Reno team is going to be a great resource for you, but you can also email me at the Chamber, and that email address is events@concordnhchamber.com. I also just wanted to mention thank you to the Center for Family Enterprise and CEO Forum for coming alongside us for this event. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to the team at Orr Reno. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on the new laws that are designed to help businesses and other organizations deal with the economic impact of the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic. I'm Steve Weiner of the Orr Reno Law Firm here in Concord, and I'm here with my colleagues Lindsay, Nadeau, and Tony Sayess. I'm happy to be here and partner with the Chamber as well as the UNH Center for Family Enterprises. We hope not only to give you some timely information, I'm also happy to have my first excuse in about a week and a half to get out of my bathrobe and put on a sport jacket. So in any event, what we plan to do is provide you with a very high level review of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, or FFCRA, which deals with paid leaves. And then Lindsay will get into some key changes, again, in a very brief high-level review of the key changes in the unemployment compensation laws. And then we'll go to Tony, who will get into a little more detail and get a little more granular in his description of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act, which is the law that deals with the loan program and loan forgiveness program that I'm sure you've all heard about. Our suspicion is that most of you are probably most interested in the loan and loan forgiveness program. So we'll allocate as much time as we can to that law. We'll also allocate a decent slice of time, hopefully 15 to 20 minutes at the end of our hour, to deal with questions that you have and that you're hopefully sending in using the Q&A function. And as Emily said, please feel free to use that Q&A function and we'll deal with those questions. So without any further delay, let's go to the next slide and talk about the FFCRA, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. This law was enacted a couple of weeks ago, March 18th. It became effective a couple of days ago, April 1st. There is some U.S. Department of Labor guidance out there already, but it's changing very quickly. It's a very fluid situation, both for this law and for the CARES law that Tony will be talking about. The final rule from the DOL is actually out there on the DOL website. If you're interested in looking at it, it will actually be formally issued on Monday, April 6th. The FFCRA has two components, the emergency paid sick leave and the emergency expanded FMLA leave. And the main takeaway, I think, on these leave laws is that these new federal laws essentially provide employees with a total of 12 weeks of new federal paid leave related to COVID-19 issues. So first, the emergency paid sick leave law, the sort of first component of the FFCRA. Basically, it provides 2 weeks of paid COVID-19 related sick leave, job protected leave. The coverage, it covers all employers with fewer than 500 employees. There's an exemption written into the law for employers with fewer than 50 employees. It's not crystal clear how that exemption will work, but basically the standard is that if your business or organization, its viability would be seriously jeopardized because of having to provide this leave, then you could potentially get an exemption. All employees are potentially eligible, whether it's full-time or part-time. The leave is in addition to any other leaves that the employee might be entitled to. So if the employee has some accrued paid time off under your own policies, this new paid sick leave is in addition to that leave, and employers cannot force employees to take or exhaust their other PTO before they get their emergency paid sick leave under the FFCRA. There are 6 reasons, qualifying reasons, why an employee can take the FFCRA paid sick leave, and they're listed there on the slide. Government isolation or quarantine order. Number 2, advice from a healthcare provider to self-quarantine, and this has created some ambiguity because some employers have been presented by employees who would not want to go to work because they are scared to go to work or worried about going to work. Technically, under the paid sick leave law, that would not be sufficient to be entitled to the paid sick leave. It has to be on the advice of a healthcare provider that self-quarantining is necessary. The third reason is experiencing symptoms. What exactly do symptoms mean? Not quite clear there, but basically the best thing to do is rely on the CDC's guidance on what the symptoms of COVID-19 are. Reason 4, caring for an individual under one of the first 2 reasons. Reason 5, caring for your child due to a school closure or daycare center closure under a government order. Number 6 is somewhat of a catch-all, other similar circumstances. Next slide, please. The amount of leave, as I said, is 2 weeks, or really 80 hours. It's prorated for part-time employees, and if you're in the situation where you have employees that have variable schedules, there's a method in the law that tells you how to calculate the amount of leave. The pay rate, the employees are entitled to their regular pay, but it's subject to certain limitations. Listed out on the slide here. If the leave is basically to care for yourself, The cap is $511 a day. If the leave is to care for someone else, the individual or your child, the cap is $200 a day. The cost of the paid leave, and this is critical, employers who pay out this paid sick leave will be entitled to recoup those costs through payroll tax credits. Originally, we thought the recoupment would only take place on a quarterly basis. More recent guidance indicates it's basically continuing on a payroll by payroll basis. And another piece of the recoupment that the DOL guidance has made clear is that the costs not only include the actual direct compensation, but also include the costs of maintaining health insurance for the employee who's on the sick leave. And the leave is job protected. You have to restore the person to his or her job when the sick leave is done. Next slide, please. The coverage, we're now going to the second component beyond the sick leave. This is the emergency expansion of the FMLA law. Basically, what this expanded FMLA leave provides is an additional 10 weeks of paid COVID-19 leave. Again, all employers with fewer than 500 employees are covered under this law. It's not as the regular FMLA is, where only employers with 50 or more employees were covered. Under this emergency expansion, it's all employers with fewer than 500 employees. All employees who have worked 30 days are potentially eligible, and it's 30 calendar days. One significant distinction between this 10-week of additional paid leave under the FMLA, distinction with the paid sick leave, is that there are not 6 qualifying reasons. There's just the one qualifying reason, and that is that the employee is unable to work or telework in order to care for their child due to the school closure or daycare closure. Next slide. Okay, the amount of the leave under the expanded FMLA is up to 12 weeks, but the first 10 days, the first 2 weeks are unpaid. So essentially, we're talking about 10 additional weeks of paid leave on top of the 2 weeks of paid sick leave. The amount or the pay rate for the 10 weeks of paid expanded FMLA is lower than with the paid sick leave. It's 2/3 of the employee's regular pay, and again, subject to caps, like the sick leave was subject to caps, but the caps here are lower, cannot exceed $200 a day or $10,000 in the aggregate. As with the sick leave, for expanded FMLA paid leave, employees have an option to use other PTO they may have accrued, but the employer cannot require that. And notice of the need for the leave is supposed to be provided by the employee as soon as practical. Next slide. The cost. The cost of the paid leave, just as with the paid sick leave, can be recouped by the employer through payroll tax credits. So again, the whole idea of these benefits is ultimately the costs are borne by the government, not by the employer. As I mentioned before, the expanded FMLE is job protected. There is an exemption for employers with fewer than 25 employees. And as a general matter, the same rule would apply here as in the regular FMLA, which is that if the employee would not have a job upon return because the entire workplace has shut down or because there's been reduction in force and a series of layoffs, and the job was going to be eliminated in any event, then restoration to the job would not be legally required. And finally, the DOL has the authority to exempt businesses with fewer than 50 employees, again, if the requirements would jeopardize the viability of the employer. So that's a very brief overview of the new paid leaves under the FFCRA. And it's time now to go to Lindsay to talk about changing unemployment benefit law.
Thanks, Steve. We are getting some questions in, so thank you. Keep the questions coming. We will answer them at the end after the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Unemployment benefits were expanded both at the state level and the federal level. So the first thing we'll go over is Executive Order number 5, which was issued by Governor Sununu. And note, a lot of people are wondering if you are eligible for unemployment if you've only had a reduction rather than a total loss of employment. And the answer is yes, you may be eligible. The executive order eliminated the 1-week waiting period that normally applies when you're applying for unemployment compensation. And then if you're intending to return to work after the COVID-19 crisis is over, then there is no longer a job seeking requirement either. And this is in recognition of the fact that the job market is pretty tough right now in a lot of industries. The unemployment compensation system was expanded to include self-employed persons, freelancers, independent contractors, public and private school teachers, and part-time workers. So where some groups were not eligible before, they are now. 100% of the payments are funded through the Unemployment Compensation Trust Fund through the state. It is not assessed against your most recent employer. So funds are 100% paid through the state Unemployment Compensation Trust Fund, with certain funds being filtered from the federal government. There are criteria to be eligible for the expanded unemployment compensation benefits, and those are a current diagnosis of COVID-19, being quarantined for COVID-19, and importantly, and this is in contrast to the federal law that Steve mentioned, this includes a self-imposed quarantine, and it also includes at the instruction of a healthcare provider or other government order. So we are hearing, as Steve mentioned, from some employers saying that they have employees who are concerned, understandably sometimes, about coming into work and spreading COVID-19. If they are able to, in good faith, certify on their unemployment application that they are self-quarantined, our understanding based on correspondence from the Department of Employment Security is that they will receive benefits even for that reason. Another criteria is if you are caring for a family member or a child, a dependent who has COVID-19 or is quarantined. And then also if you are caring for a family member or a child who is unable to care for themselves because of a school closure or a daycare closure, which certainly a lot of families are facing lately. In addition, about 10 days after Executive Order number 5 came out, the federal government, as you probably are aware, passed the CARES Act. And this further expanded the unemployment compensation benefits that people are eligible for. So prior, the New Hampshire maximum weekly amount was about $427 a week. The CARES Act more than doubled that amount and adds an additional $600 per week in benefits. This is 100% federally funded. Recipients will automatically get the $600 a week if they are currently receiving unemployment benefits, whether they are receiving them for a COVID-19 related reason or not. So everyone in the system will be getting this. It runs through July 31st. And it's estimated that this will constitute about a 95% wage replacement for people. So that is a pretty big boost. It also expanded the amount of time from 26 weeks to 39 weeks that you may be receiving unemployment compensation. So there's also a longer time period in addition to the higher amount of compensation you can get. So that is a very quick overview, but Tony has a lot of information to share on the CARES Act And so I will turn it over to Tony.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's been a very, very busy few weeks. It's been a crazy time, I'm sure for everybody. It was less than 1 week ago, President Trump signed the new CARES Act into law, which brought us this new Paycheck Protection program under the SBA 7A loan program. It seems like it was like, a million years ago that happened, but we've been trying to get up to speed. I'm sure a lot of advisors have been trying to do that in the past week. We started out just by reading the law itself, and then slowly every day some additional guidance has kind of trickled out as to how that program will work. Over the last 12 hours, 31 pages of additional guidance have come out on how the PPP Paycheck Protection Program will work under the CARES Act. So we're it's kind of a moving target as far as advising people on how to qualify for this loan program and the whole application process. So we're shifting our guidance that we're giving to our clients on a day-to-day basis, but we'll try to give you the best current advice that we can. So in the past few weeks, we talked earlier about these family leave and the sick leave programs under the Coronavirus First Act. That was only like 3 weeks ago. That seems like it was even 2 decades ago that stuff came out. We have a few different loan programs, the Paycheck Protection Program loan program, and from a few weeks ago, we had the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, the EIDL or EIDL loans, part of which was a $10,000 advance that was forgivable for that. And in addition, we have new potential tax credits for employers. So we're going to touch on each of these. We're going to focus on the Paycheck Protection Program. I think that's what most people are interested in. So this is an SBA loan program. So how to apply for it, you go to an SBA lender. Many of you probably already are in touch with one and have perhaps applied for previous SBA loans. That program is live. I've heard people, they were going to submit applications at 12:01 this morning. So for small businesses, they can apply today. In 1 week's time, companies that run through as themselves as independent contractors or self-employed, the deadline or the application window opens in a week. So this Paycheck Protection Program, it is a $349 billion program passed by Congress, signed by President Trump. The goal is that employers will retain their employees, not lay them off, or if they've laid them off, to rehire them. It does cover some other expenses besides payroll costs, but the intent really is that employers will keep those people on payroll, and the trade-off is that much of such a paycheck protection loan would be forgiven, and so it essentially would turn into a grant. It is geared towards small businesses. I'm assuming most of the attendees today are those small businesses with less than 500 employees. There are special rules for things like franchises where there might be total of more than 500 spread out across the US, but they're looking at those things on a location by location basis. So I'm assuming pretty much everyone on this call would be able to qualify based on an employee count number. So to, how much can you borrow under this PPP program? It's a little bit of a complicated formula where you look at payroll costs basically for 2019. And you look at things, I think we'll go into the next slide, but basically you look at payroll costs on a monthly basis, you multiply that by 2.5. So payroll costs include things like salaries, wages, tips, stuff like that, as well as any, vacation leave pay, family leave, sick leave, dismissal and separation allowances. Importantly, payments for group healthcare benefits, that is included. Retirement, contribution payments included. State unemployment tax is included. And there's special rules for people who are sole proprietors and people who are independent contractors. Maybe they have their own LLC and they work through that. So basically, you look at that payroll cost for the employer on a monthly basis, and you multiply that times 2.5. Now, there is a cap where when you take all of those things together, for any individual, it's more than $100,000 on an annual basis, then you can only count up towards that $100,000 on an annual basis. I think on a monthly basis, it works out to something like $8,600. So there are limits, for how much you can get as payroll costs that you use to multiply by that 2.5. Maybe we can go back to the previous slide, Lindsay. All right, so the key feature, why is everyone so excited, and why is this a potential lifeline for everybody? There is supposed to be forgiveness. This is a loan, you apply through your SBA lender, but there's supposed to be forgiveness of a certain amount that we'll get into a little bit later. There are certification requirements. The application, we're going to go through the application, very short, it's 2 pages. About half of that is going to be certifications that people are going to have to make. There are some great features to it. There's no personal guarantees, and you don't have to show your typical collateral that you might normally in an SBA loan. All right, the loans are, it was a little, the statute provided for one thing, and as they've come out with rules, things have shifted a little bit. So they're pushing out this program today as a 2-year loan at 1% interest. And they've said today that actually the interest component can be part of the amount that is forgiven, if pursuant to the typical rules for how you qualify for the loan forgiveness. Now, a few weeks ago, they instituted this EIDL loan program. We've had a lot of questions last week. Hey, I already applied for the EIDL loan. Can I also do a PPP loan? All right, the statute makes clear that you can do an EIDL loan as well as a PPP loan, but it has to be for different purposes. If you've already applied for an EIDL loan, you can roll that into a new PPP loan. And one of the EIDL loan functions or features is a $10,000 advance as soon as you apply for that, which is forgivable. So that amount, that if you get that $10,000 advance, that amount isn't going to be then given as part of the PPP program. So it's kind of, there are different rules to prevent double dipping. That's one of them. So we can go to the next slide. All right, so we've kind of, we can go back a slide. All right, so we talked about a key thing is going to be calculating your payroll costs, and you're going to have to show this when you apply. The SBA lender is going to, want to see some evidence. Hey, how did you arrive to this number where you got, 2.5 times a certain number? And you're going to have to show things like your payroll costs for last year. The statute provides that it's supposed to be for the 12 months before applying. So that would really be like April 1st, 2019 to, March 31st. But, I've seen some places where people don't have that data in a easily, compilable form to give to the banks, that they're taking 2019 numbers for the calendar year. So just be aware of that. How do you calculate that? It's been shifting a little bit this week. So, and again, $100,000 isn't just the salary, $100,000. Maybe someone makes $70,000, but with all their benefits, it adds up to over $100,000. They're going to be capped at $100,000 per employee for calculating that. And sick and family leave, you can't get a credit for, having someone out on family leave under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. and then also, use that pay as part of this PPP program. So next. All right, so the loan forgiveness portion, is what is really attracting people to this program. So the guidance isn't fully out yet on how that forgiveness is going to work. It's supposed to be this, that you get your loan sometime, maybe it's in April, hopefully, and there's a covered period, and that covered period goes to June 30th. You're supposed to use that, the PPP loan proceeds for covering your payroll costs. If your business owns its building, there's a mortgage interest, otherwise rent and utilities. Now, as far as the forgiveness goes, they've put out guidance that says, all right, we're only going to allow for forgiveness portion. 75% basically has to go to payroll costs. We're not going to allow any more than 25% for forgiveness for mortgage interest, rent, or utilities. It's not in the statute, but that's how they're interpreting it. They're expecting that although there's $349 billion in this program, there's going to be more demand than that from small businesses. So they have to kind of apportion it. Now, there are exceptions to forgiveness. And those exceptions or reductions have to do with if you've reduced employee headcount and you haven't, let's say, corrected that by June 30th, or if you've reduced wages by over 25%. So there's special rules, and there's different time testing periods where you look at, well, kind of the period in 2019 that we're thinking about, February 15th to June 30th, and looking at kind of the current period, and you kind of compare headcounts. And if your headcount has gone down and you haven't rehired those employees by June 30th, then you kind of look at that ratio of how it's gone down, and then the amount of forgiveness you might otherwise get will be reduced. So let's say you reduced your headcount by 25% and you didn't rehire those people by June 30th, and let's say you borrowed $1 million, and you might normally be able to get $1 million forgiveness. Well, then you'll only get $750,000 of forgiveness. It's roughly how it's working. Again, guidance isn't fully out yet, so we're kind of all learning this on the fly. There's some technical rules for how to calculate, what the reductions actually are there. The key policy is the government is pushing this money out. It really wants employers to keep people on payroll, to rehire their folks that they may have, laid off, rather than have those people be collecting unemployment. So, all right, we can go to the next slide. All right, so the application is out. If anybody needs a copy of it, we're happy to email it. You can also kind of Google it from the SBA website. We're going to go through the application. So just give me a second. All right. So this is the application. It's not very long. It is one page. This is the second page where you sign it. There's 2 pages of kind of instructions, but the instructions really are a lot of disclaimers. And there's very little, the actual part to help you fill it out, instructions for completing this form, it is half a page or less. So people are really trying to just figure it out, as they go along. There's a little paragraph here for how to calculate your average monthly payroll. So the application form, it's going to ask you what type of business you are. Sole proprietor, LLC, S Corp, C Corp, partnership. Again, there's no instructions explaining, hey, I'm an LLC, but I'm taxed as a partnership. I wouldn't, things are happening so fast, I would just say, okay, put LLC. It's going to ask for your DBA or trade name, your business legal name, your business address, your EIN or social security number, phone number, primary contact person, email address. Then you get down to this important stuff, average monthly payroll, which is definitely a little bit of, you have to use maybe a spreadsheet or something to figure it out based on all those different costs that we talked about, not just the salary, but also things like health insurance. Then there's, I'm going to assume most people don't already have, and they're probably not going to get an EIDL loan, economic injury disaster loan. And then it's going to ask for your number of employees. Wants to make sure you have under 500. It's going to ask you what the use of the loan is for: payroll, lease or mortgage, utilities, other. I don't really know what you would really put in other. Obviously, they want to see it's going to be used for payroll. It's going to ask about who is owning the applicant. And if it's more than 20%, you're going to need to provide some details of all 20% owners. So owner names, titles, percentages, their social security numbers or EINs, and address. Then there's a bunch of different questions, and these have to do with, are you suspended from participating in federal programs? Have you ever obtained a SBA loan and been in default? Are you the owner of another business? If yes, list all businesses. This has to do with kind of figuring out, well, if you have more than 500 employees spread out across a bunch of different businesses, called affiliation rules. And typically they do apply so that you would count different businesses owned. There are just those exceptions for things really in the hospitality industry. And then have you applied for other loans, economic injury disaster loans, in the past 2 months? I'm assuming most people haven't. So some more questions about, have any of the 20% owners been, criminally indicted, charged, whatnot? If you click yes, you're going to have to explain it. I assume most people are going to click no. Another similar question down here. Is the United States the principal place of residence for all employees of the applicant included in the payroll calculation? I'm assuming here in Concord, we'll all be checking yes, or most of us will anyway. And is the applicant a franchise listed in the SBA's franchise directory? All right, and so then there's some certifications that have to be made about, that the applicant was in business on February 15th. Here's one, current economic uncertainty makes this loan necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. It's very little guidance on what that actually means. But, almost every business is being hit very hard by, we're all supposed to stay at home. The refunds will be used to retain workers, or the funds will be used to retain workers and maintain payroll or make mortgage interest payments, lease payments, and utility payments as specified under the Paycheck Protection Program rules. I understand that the funds are knowingly used for unauthorized purposes. Federal government may hold me legally liable, such as for charges of fraud. I assume that most of the attendees here, could easily use that money to make very good payments towards payroll, rent, mortgage payments, utility. Obviously concerned about fraud. They should be concerned about fraud. It would be very easily to defraud this program, but this, small businesses really need it. And, there's some other kind of warning boxes that you're going to check off, basically acknowledging the program rules, and, that if you abuse it, you might go into prison, owe $1 million, and that the lender is going to, try to confirm all the stuff you're telling it. And then, a signature and a date. As far as getting grants from, the federal government, or loans that are forgiven from the federal government, this is a pretty slim application form. the intent really is to push out a ton of, federal government money as quickly as possible. And hopefully it works. And hopefully, the SBA lenders are able to process this quickly and get money out to the businesses that desperately need it, as soon as possible. So let's go back to the PowerPoint, Lindsay. All right. So, a few weeks ago, they came out with this different loan program, economic injury disaster loan, generally not forgivable like the PPP loan. So as soon as the PPP loan came out last week, a lot of people who had these economic injury disaster loan applications were suddenly like, hey, can I switch? And you can roll over your economic injury disaster loan to a PPP loan, so long as it is for the same uses that you could use for a PPP loan. There's a higher interest rate, there's a longer term. You generally can borrow less under that amount, but it's not tied to things like the payroll calculation. So, definitely we have some clients that we're advising, take out the EIDL loan for certain things, like, an example, you have contractual payments to make and you don't want to breach those contracts. So, use the EIDL loan for that and use the PPP loan for covering your rent and payroll costs. We'll go to the next slide. So, as part of that, there's been some questions. Hey, can I just get the $10,000 from the EIDL grant? The way I read it is the EIDL grant is actually an advance of loan funds, which is forgivable. So I think you do have to actually apply for the EIDL loan in order to get that $10,000 advance, which is, you don't have to repay it, which is why it's, basically a grant. Next slide. All right, now, at the same time that they passed the law last Friday with the PPP loan program, they also passed a bunch of tax provisions. We don't have time to go into all those tax provisions, but there's one that's kind of important, which is an employee retention tax credit. And a lot of businesses are kind of deciding, hey, am I better off taking the PPP loan, and get, forgiveness for a good chunk of that, if not all of it, or these employee retention tax credits. Some businesses have too many employees and they're not eligible for the PPP loan, in which case it makes total sense for them all to take the employee retention tax credit. But there are some employers who could be eligible for a PPP loan, but they actually end up better when you run the numbers with the employee retention tax credit. So this is a credit for up to 50% of wages paid to employees, up to $10,000 per employee. And those wages include things like the health insurance benefits. It's a credit against employment tax liability, and it's actually refundable credit. You cannot do both. You cannot get both an employee retention tax credit and a PPP loan. And from the analysis that I've read, if your average employee comp is less than $24,000 a year, you might be better off taking the tax credit than the PPP loan. You would be able to borrow less under the PPP loan under that compensation multiplied by 2.5 formula if you did have employees with an average comp of less than $24,000 a year. The $10,000 credit might be better for you. There are different rules that apply if you have 100 or fewer employees or more than 100 employees. Generally, it's more favorable if you have 100 or fewer employees. I assume a lot of Concord, New Hampshire businesses do fit into that 100 or fewer. Now, you have to have operations fully or partially suspended due to COVID-19, or gross receipts declined by more than 50% when compared to the same quarter of 2019. That can, that 50% analysis can be a little difficult to compute because, you have to have a calendar quarter. So right now, we just started Q2. No one knows what's going to happen. We can all anticipate that revenues are going to drop by 50%. But, we have to wait till the end of the quarter to actually know that. So it's a little bit uncertainty when you're thinking about these credits. Some other important tax changes that occurred. There's a potential to delay the payment of employment taxes for 2020 and push those off into 2021 and 2022. They modified net operating loss rules. So if you have a loss in 2020, and a lot of businesses might, you should be able to go back and amend your earlier 2019 and 2018 tax returns and get some refund from those amounts you might have paid last year and the year before. They've also modified excess business loss limits for pass-through businesses. And of course, they passed the provision that's going to push money out to individuals, on how much income that you had, but those checks should be coming directly, from Treasury to individuals. There's so much going on. We could spend hours on it, but we really want to get to the questions.
All right, so we have a lot of questions, so I will do my best to run through some of them here. And we know we probably won't have enough time, so we will see if there's a later time that we might be able to do some more Q&A, and also our contact information is available at the end of this presentation, so you can contact the chamber or contact us. So one of the questions for Steve is, if an employee is on paid sick leave due to some approved reason other than their own personal health, can an employer still ask them to do work from home if they're able?
Yeah, I think an employer could ask, and I mean, in essence, that sounds like an intermittent leave sort of arrangement. And the DOL guidance so far has indicated, yeah, if you can have an agreement between the employer and the employee, under which essentially the employee is using some of it paid sick leave, but also doing some work if that's feasible.
And Steve, what sort of documentation is required for the expanded sick leave?
We normally, for sick leaves or FMLA leaves that are due to health conditions, the employer is entitled to get doctor's notes or more formal medical certifications. It's still legally permissible, but the DOL has basically said, at least right now, employers should relax those standards. I still think a wise employer would want to get something in writing from at least the employee, and if possible from the healthcare provider. But because of the impact of the pandemic on the healthcare system, the DOL is basically saying, employers, let's be reasonable, if at all possible, to not further overburden the healthcare providers.
A few people have asked whether or who gets the extra $600 in unemployment benefits. That goes to anyone who is receiving unemployment. So yes, that applies even if it's above your normal wages. You would automatically get that $600 on top of where your state benefit is.
Lindsay, maybe you said this already, but is that $600, is it only limited to people unemployed due specifically to COVID-19, or is it basically anybody who's become unemployed at this period?
It is anyone receiving unemployment, whether it's COVID-19 related or not. That's a good question. Tony, a few people have asked whether independent contractors who have employees can apply for the PPP today, or if they need to wait until April 10th.
So independent contractors, my understanding is that they wait till April 10th. Are they, if they're sole proprietors, so they, they have their own business. That is my understanding.
A couple of folks have asked when for the unemployment benefits, when employees will get that extra $600. My understanding is it was supposed to start this week, so those should be in paychecks coming out soon. I do believe that the State Department of Employment Security is pretty bogged down. They say that payments start within 8 days of applying, although I'm not sure if that's still an accurate timeline given how many applicants they are seeing.
Yeah, Lindsay, there was one question I noticed in the Q&A function about that I've heard before, and it's not totally clear, but talking about, well, because the unemployment has been enhanced significantly, what happens if someone is getting their unemployment benefits and basically doesn't want to come back to work, even though the business has now recovered, or at least somewhat recovered, and wants to bring the employee back, which is an interesting question. And also has some implications, I suppose, for the PPP program, where the employers are required, or, you know, there's a good reason to bring people back. That's the whole purpose of the PPP loan. I mean, from the PPP's perspective, Tony, do you have any sense of that?
I'm sorry, Steve. I was still focused on the previous question.
Okay. Well, I guess from the employment, that's okay. That's okay. You may not be listening to me, but maybe the people who are in the webinar are listening. I would say that the employer doesn't have the right to force the employee to come back, but if the employee doesn't have a reason not to come back, and the employer wishes to have the employee come back, especially if they're in a furlough status, I think the employer could basically require the employee to come back at risk of the employee no longer having a job once he or she is done with the furlough. Now, I think an employer would want to think long and hard before doing something like that. But I suppose it is conceivable, depending on the way the numbers work out, that a person could be collecting more in unemployment than they were actually earning in their paycheck. The other thing to keep in mind, I suppose, is health insurance. If they were employed, you know, if you have a group health plan, the employee is getting that benefit, whereas at least after a certain period of time, they won't have that benefit anymore while they're unemployed.
So I'd like to go back to the previous question. Can I take over the screen, Lindsay?
Sure. Well, actually, I don't know. Do you want me to switch slides?
What's that? Oh, so all right, so the previous question went to when can people apply? And so this is information right from the SBA website. And it says, starting April 3rd, small businesses and sole proprietorships can apply and receive loans. Starting April 10th, independent contractors and self-employed individuals can apply for and receive. So I find it personally very confusing, because you can be a small business and an independent contractor at the same time. You can be a self-employed individual and a sole proprietor. So, you know, clearly they have some guidance here that says, well, those people are supposed to wait until April 10th, but I don't know why they wouldn't be able to do it today. So this is just one example of things being pushed out so fast that, you know, I don't think that necessarily people in Washington, D.C. are fully thinking it through carefully. And, you know, I have full sympathy for those people. They probably aren't sleeping. They're, you know, being pulled in 10 different directions and trying to get this program up and running in a week. But that's kind of the ambiguity that exists right now. And it's, you know, sometimes hard to advise people what to do right now.
That's a good point, Tony. Steve, one of the questions was what to do about temporary employees. Do you have any advice, or Tony, any advice on how temporary employees fit into all of this?
Well, temporary employees, if the questioner means by that employees who are you got with through a staffing agency, like temporary staffing agency. One issue for them is whether those costs could be included in payroll costs for purposes of your PPP calculation. And based on the guidance we've looked at, I think the answer is those fees to your staffing agency do not get included in all likelihood. If you're talking about whether temporary employees get paid sick leave or paid expanded FMLA leave, I think the answer is yes, they would be entitled to those federal paid leave, paid sick leave and paid FMLA leave entitlements.
Are churches eligible for the Paycheck Protection Program?
Well, nonprofits are eligible.
I saw just in the guidance this morning, Tony, that more guidance is coming out for religious institutions. It sounds like they probably are, but there does need some more clarification on that.
There was a paragraph on religious liberty, which I skimmed. Interesting question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head. That's one that requires some more thought.
For the PPP loan, do your payroll costs include the employer portion of Social Security and Medicare?
No, that one is definitive. It's in the statute and it's in the guidance.
Do you know of anyone who's actually received the $10,000 emergency advance?
I personally did not.
I haven't heard of one. I have not heard of a client yet either, but there probably are some out there.
And does workers' comp get included?
I believe it, workers' comp, the unemployment insurance tax. So workers' comp, that one I'm not sure about.
Yeah, I haven't seen any guidance on that point either, but it is a question we've heard. Is business loan interest the same as mortgage interest when calculating under the PPP?
No. I don't believe so.
What happens if you've already had to do a furlough or layoff, Steve? Or
Well,
this is a question for Tony.
Yeah, well, it could be for both of us, I guess. I mean, what does it mean if someone is furloughed, which is essentially means sort of put on an unpaid administrative leave? You know, what are they entitled to? They are not entitled if they're really not actively employed anymore. They're in a furlough or temporary layoff status. They're not entitled, according to the DOL guidance, with the paid sick leave or paid extended FMLA leave. For the purposes of the PPP, I think, Tony, what you said before is, you know, the whole idea is you try to bring those employees back and rehire them especially by June 30th, right, in order to maximize your possible loan forgiveness.
That is true. And you know, there of those certifications that we kind of went through very quickly, on that second page of the application, you know, there's various boxes to check off. And some of those boxes have to you know, say about, hey, you know, this program is all about, you know, workers employed. And you're checking that box off and you're signing it. So, you know, query, are you opening yourself up to exposure for, you know, potential future, you know, government action? If you check that box and say, yeah, I understand this program is all about, you know, bringing, you know, keeping people employed, and then you use those, you know, 2.5 times payroll from last year, and then you know, don't bring any headcount back, you know, or you bring them back on June 29th. You know, those are open questions, and we don't really have guidance yet on the loan forgiveness portion of this. But, you know, I could see some scenarios where people, you know, interpret that and say, well, I don't know, maybe you're not eligible for forgiveness because you kind of took all this money, you know, basically understanding it was for this type of purpose. You used it all on your mortgage interest or all on your rent. You get people back to the very last day. We don't know yet. It's unclear, but it seems to go against the intent of what they're trying to accomplish with this program.
And so I see it's 10 o'clock. So the last question, is this the final application for the PPP, or will a revised version be coming out? And I think, Tony, you had mentioned that this is the application right now, but changes have been made already. So there may be a revised version sometime in the future too.
Yeah, there was definitely a change like overnight. So, you know, as they get, you know, feedback on some of the ambiguity, and that ambiguity definitely exists. And I envision, you know, additional changes, notwithstanding that they might not say this is the final application. Yeah, I can see that. I do think there could be, you know, a flood of applications right away. And so, you know, they have $349 billion in this program, and how long will it take to, you know, go through that amount of money? Kind of reminds me of, you know, immigration law and H-1B applications, and they have a certain number of people, all of it gets, you know, applied for on the first day of eligibility. But we're just kind of in uncharted waters. So we'll see.
Okay. Emily, did you have any final words?
Thank you so much for presenting today. I just want to emphasize again that we really appreciate your thoughts here on all of these changes, and understand that things are happening, like you said, overnight. So for you guys to put in the effort to do all this research to provide answers to people immediately, we really appreciate. So again, I know there were a lot of questions that may have not been answered. Please reach out to Orr Reno or the Chamber if you have additional questions that were not covered. We've also recorded this session, so you can go back and refer to it later. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you at a future webinar.
Thanks, Emily.
Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye.